And welcome back for week 2 of talking about the rite of reconciliation. And the first thing I wanted to ask, I did get a question from somebody, but before I regale you with some sort of story about affect theory, which I really want to do today, I want to see if there are questions or thoughts that have come out of last week's work, or as you continue to think about things like reconciliation and sin and just the topic in general. If there's anybody who wants to share or ask, you can always use chat or email, but I just want to open the floor to you. Susan?
The one you sent out today about Noah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I understood that at all.
Well, would you say more?
The fact that God was unhappy with humans because they were violent, and that he wanted to get rid of them. But he liked Noah, and so he saved him, and the animals. But that isn't a view of God that I have.
Great, and you don't have to. I think what's really interesting to think about, right, is that people tell stories to make meaning out of their lives. That's what stories do. And frankly, there are scientific stories that are ways of making meaning, and then there are mythical stories. I don't mean they're made up. I mean, they talk about the inner reality of things. This is what we do. We tell stories to make meaning. And I think you have a lot of options in the Noah story. I will tell you too, I don't think I would worship a God who engaged in genocide. I wouldn't.
Right.
And the truth is, I don't have to. And I think we can think about what the story is trying to say, and we can also have a conversation with the story as well. When I tell the story to kids, I say, God invited people to build boats, and only one person did. And that's sad. So that there's this invitation to everybody and only one person listened. I do think there's something really important to hear though in the story, which is not that God is unhappy with people, but that God grieves the choices that we make. And I actually can make a lot of sense about that. It doesn't mean I wish I'd never done it. Again, I think that's the really important thing about repentance. It's not some kind of regret. It's just vulnerability to the choices other people make. And to me, it's very interesting that the people who wrote this story down, the tragic flaw they found in human beings is a proclivity and inclination towards violence. So the primal story was not that human beings are prideful. That's like what C.S. Lewis decided, which, hey, look, any meta theory's got problems. Good for him for coming up with one. But the original audience wasn't worried about pride. They were worried about violence, which I think is actually, there's something really compelling about that. To think through that one of the fundamental human problems is our proclivity and inclination towards violence. And that means a lot more to me having read this book called Sapiens. There was like 300 other humanoid species like the Neanderthals and the Homo africanus, and they've all been wiped out. And the book says basically Homo sapiens killed them. And instead of like there being diversity, we just wiped them out, which is sort of it's sort of sad. But it resonates with the story, with this.
Well, and we haven't changed any.
I'm not sure we have. And so then the story becomes a great way to describe things. Not so that we can, not a prescription, but so that we can do it different, hopefully. Yeah, and I think that becomes a really important thing when we think about repentance. Again, the kind of repentance that God does isn't, I wish you were never born. The kind of repentance God does is, I'm hurting with you because I have a vision about where that's going and what that's doing to other people that I also love and am invested in. And if I could control you, then you wouldn't be you. So there's just grief about that. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, Susan, there's not an answer. I think there are multiple ways we can hear these stories and either flow with them or flow against them. But the goal, right, is always how do we get more life, not how do we condone our bad behavior.
I see that. Thank you.
Why God picked Noah is a great question too, and you'll see that as we unfurl, because the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is he plants a vineyard and gets drunk. I mean, you know, the guy was an Episcopalian. He sure wasn't an evangelical. That's what I want to say. He might have been Catholic, you know, but like that's the most righteous guy on the planet. Somebody who immediately gets drunk, really? Boy, there's hope for us, don't you think?
Absolutely.
And it means, right, like our own like weird habits, like alcohol abuse. I'm not condoning that, but I'm saying they don't disqualify us from God enjoying us, and that I think is very hopeful. And it's a good reminder as we think about forgiveness and reconciliation, right? Is like we don't have to forgive to be good enough. We don't have to forgive to earn God's favor. It's really our invitation. Well, I think so. I'm trying to believe that. Ellen?
So that's kind of the question that I've been thinking about this week, and trying to connect forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation. And I had an example where I suffered abuse by an individual who's no longer alive. But even if he were still alive, I can't forgive him. And so how that relates to redemption, is it possible that you don't have to forgive the person, but maybe forgive yourself for what you allowed to happen as a result of that? And then what about reconciliation? Where does that come in?
Thank you. I think that's actually probably one of the most important questions, honestly, that we could even just have a conversation about. And what I'd love to do is kind of start in the middle of what I prepared instead of starting at the beginning of what I prepared, because I think it's a really good question. By the way, feel free to like chat or say like, this is all a bunch of junk and I hate it. But I think it's not just semantics. I think like what we don't have is a really good sense of how forgiveness and reconciliation and redemption are different things. And so there's people out there that are much smarter than I am. And I want to start with maybe what forgiveness is according to them and ways it makes sense to me. So you've heard me say this in church before, possibly. Anne Lamott says forgiveness is giving up all hope of having had a different past. And you may say to yourself, well, boy, that sounds a lot like acceptance or settling. And I think that's exactly what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not something I offer somebody else. Forgiveness is a gift that I give myself. And I think we usually get that wrong. A lot of times, I think, especially in church, I have this idea that somebody's done something bad and I decide I'm going to let that go. So I go to them and I say, I forgive you. And I really want to say as a best practice, we should never do that. I think if people ask for our forgiveness, we grant it. But I think to go and say, I forgive you without having been asked is actually like a backhanded compliment.
Yes.
Because it puts you in this unequal position of power where you're sort of the great white hope and you're just going to give this to somebody else who didn't even ask for it. I think instead, right, forgiveness is this ability to say, this thing happened to me, whether I had any role in it or I completely did not deserve it. And it has made me who I am. And I choose to be grateful for who I am. Is it okay that that happened to me? I mean, of course it wasn't okay, but I'm okay with who I am.
All right, all right.
And do I wish I weren't abused? Yes. And I wouldn't change who I am. And that's, I think, the hard tension. It's a both and. Abuse is not okay. It's not. But if it's happened to us, here we are. And can we be grateful for who we are, even over things we had no control over? To me, that seems like the really difficult thing, to hold both of those. So I think no one needs to be involved in your forgiveness except for yourself.
Nice.
What we get from, and this is a little bit of work from Barbara Crafton, right? So forgiveness, it is a gift and it's not a job. Like God has not employed you to be agents of forgiveness. God hopes that you will enter into forgiveness because God hopes you'll enjoy your life. Now, gifts, right, are different from investments. Gifts are things that are yours to enjoy or not use. Gifts are yours to misuse. Gifts are yours to never even open if you don't want to. That's different from investments, right? Because investments they have strings attached to them, and investments can be taken away from you if you're not a good steward of them. So I think it's really helpful to think not only is God not an investor, God's a gift giver, but that forgiveness is not an investment. Really, forgiveness is a gift. You don't have to do it to be God's friend. And I want to say it a little bit differently. I think God is really clear that forgiveness is really difficult. And I used to think that God would be really mad at me if I didn't forgive because I'm supposed to. But I actually think God is a lot more compassionate than I usually settle for. And so I think God is really aware of how difficult this is. And if you can't do it, I think God gets it. Like, I think God understands, okay, that's tough. And here is where I think we turn toward like what our Christian hope is, quite honestly. I don't know about like pearly gates and literal flying beings with harps, but I do have this conviction that ultimately God is going to do this for us. And if we can't do it now, God will do it when we die. Because when we die, we don't have any more control, so we can't resist the good things God has for us. Now, there are, and this I think is true, there are people for very good reason I don't want to forgive, and God gets that. But God's way is bigger than mine, so forgiveness is going to happen in the end. If I can choose to believe that that's a good thing, I think that's probably the first step. If I can't, God gets it, and that's okay. I just think forgiveness is the biggest gift we give to ourselves, right? Because as Nelson Mandela said, forgiveness is releasing a prisoner and then realizing the prisoner was you. And really what forgiveness means, right, is it's overturning that 90-10 rule, where in moments of intense emotion, 90% of it is from something that happened like yesterday or 40 years ago. And only 10% of it has anything to do with what's happening right now. So forgiveness is really letting go of all of that past stuff so you can actually just be where you are. And you can think through this, right? If you've raised children, or if you've been married, or frankly, if you've ever had a friend. Sometimes a kid or an adult will do something that by itself is so insignificant. But you remember the other 90 times it happened, and it's the straw that breaks your back. So imagine if you could live in the moment instead of living with that cumulative weight. It would be so much easier to be well with anybody. What Barbara Crafton says also that I think is really helpful is forgiveness is not forgetting. It's not. It's not exonerating or an acquittal. It's not pardoning somebody, and it's not a matter of degree. And so I think, again, we use this word to our detriment. Forgiveness means I'm grateful for who I am, no matter what right or wrong was done to me. I accept what's happened to me in my life, earned, deserved, or not. And it's really hard.
So maybe then would you be able to say that reconciliation is not necessarily between two people, but you with your better self?
So I think that's fair. I think there's a lot of kinds of reconciliation. And I'm going to say, I think the rite of reconciliation, we often think, oh, I'm going to get reconciled to God. And I think actually what the rite does with God's help is helps us get reconciled with ourselves. Yep, I think that's exactly right. And then I think within relationships, right, where there has been some breach of trust, whether that was through abuse or neglect or inattention, that reconciliation between two people is when you both want a future together. And this is really difficult because you can never force reconciliation to happen, because if you both don't want it, you won't get it. And probably all of us have had the experience where somebody is closed, and maybe even they were the abuser, quite honestly. They're closed, and you try and you try and you try to get them to open, and they won't. And that's the difficulty with reconciliation. You both have to want it, and you have to be willing to work through the awkwardness of you might want something very different from each other, but you're moving toward that future together. So again, I probably sound really bad theologically, but I do think the rite of reconciliation is not for God. It is God's gift to you so that you can be reconciled to yourself. This is what I believe about all sacraments. They are not ways of earning some kind of grace or you're deficient until you get them. They're ways of really entering into the gifts that God has had for you all along and wants you to deepen into. I am going to tell you, I am a big believer in penance. If you do something to hurt somebody, it is very appropriate that you try to make it up to them, except when doing so would cause them more pain. I believe in that because that's the way you repair relationships and you give to them and you also give to yourself. But again, this isn't all about just things I've done. This is about things that have been done to me sometimes. The older I get, the more I realize how there were these, and this is why we started talking about, I think, in a really positive way, just thinking through the way memories work. There were these little turns of phrase, and if I'm really honest, people probably didn't mean them the way I took them and have allowed them to burden me, but they really have defined much of my own life. And I often find myself thinking, God, I wish they hadn't said that. My life would be so much more joyful if they hadn't said that or done that. And forgiveness and reconciliation with myself is about saying, what's done is done, let it be. And I choose to be grateful for who I am. And I don't have to wallow in that phrase or that thing that was done to me anymore. By the way, I'm not trying to say that if you're not happy, it's because you choose to be unhappy. This stuff is really difficult. Really difficult. Especially when something was done to you that you didn't earn or deserve. I do think it's very fair, Ellen, that I can forgive somebody and never want to see them again. And I would say, right, like we heard about this in seminary, that there are pastors who, like a beaten spouse will come in and the pastor will say, well, you need to go back because God believes in reconciliation. And like, I think there's hell to pay for remarks like that. I don't mean eternal punishment. I just mean like, that is so wrong. At the same time, if somebody knows what they're doing and they choose to go back, that's what they've chosen. And you know what? Sometimes it does work out. I don't know if I have enough strength to be that person. And so I think, people say, well, you made vows when you're married. Yes, and the first time somebody hit you, they broke their vows. The first time, not the 10th time. And you have to decide what reconciliation looks like. And it wasn't fair and it wasn't right. But to be a battered spouse the rest of your life really is to hold yourself back. And making that transition, I think, is really, really difficult. Again, I think you have to hear the nuance if you can't get past that, it's not your fault. And God understands it. I think what God hopes is that we'll open ourselves to being present no matter what's done. And I don't know, I'm probably saying this in the not right way. Let me pause, because I'm not saying what happened is okay. I'm saying whatever's happened, can I be okay with who I am?
I used to say it was choosing to be a survivor and not a victim, meaning a different way of looking at it, and not being, not having the rest of my life colored by the experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's right. And I think the thing is, right, even if you've been, no matter what abuse has happened to you, and again, it isn't okay, right? To live in a state of being defined by that is really conceding ultimate victory to somebody that you don't want to give up. And I don't think it is about struggling against being defined by this person. I mean, maybe that's a step in the process we all need to take. I think it really is trying to say, how can I be in the skin that I have? Darlene's going to say something, and hopefully she's going to straighten me out.
No, I'm going to echo you. The feeling we have of anger, my thinking about anger is that it's a God-given emotion and that it's helpful to us. It helps us identify emotionally when we've been violated, and it helps us move away from the violator or the situation that is harmful to us. But after a while, the anger, if we hang on to it, hurts us, begins to hurt us because we hold it so long. And it doesn't hurt the perpetrator. The perpetrator probably could care less whether or not we're angry at them, because they don't have that capacity to have empathy for us. So our anger does not hurt them. It only hurts ourselves. So for me, forgiveness is not so much, it's not at all forgiving them for what they've done to us. It's being willing to let go of our anger so that it no longer hurts us. The longer we're angry, the more they are hurting us. The perpetrator continues to hurt us because we are living in the past, like you talked about. So it's a process of letting go of the anger. Just because we know we should doesn't mean we can. Like you said, it's a very difficult process. But for me in the past, my prayers have been, help me to be willing to let go of my anger. Take this from me. Help, just give me the willingness to let go of the anger. And just having the willingness is one step toward moving toward that.
Yeah. And I think I really appreciate you saying that, Darlene. And I think sometimes even the most hopeful prayer I can say is, God, help me to be willing to be made willing.
Yes.
And I know there's this really great Buddhist meditation that basically you think of somebody and you hold them in your mind's eye and you say, may you be free from pain.
Yes.
And maybe that's the biggest thing I can do. But I think like the first person to hold that way in our mind's eye is ourselves. Mm-hmm. And forgiveness looks like that. Hey, this has happened to you and may you be free from pain. And I don't, again, chronic pain's not okay, but having had it, I will tell you this, when I fought against the chronic pain, it hurt a lot more than when I said, I have it. And that didn't mean, by the way, I shouldn't have tried intervention. Having tried all the intervention I could and gotten nowhere, at a certain point, acceptance was when I just moved my body in a different way. And it was, and I don't want to say it wasn't so bad, but it wasn't so bad. Hear that I tried the medical intervention first. That's really, really important. And I do wonder, I do wonder, how would my adolescence have been difficult if I hadn't really held on to these things, or if these people hadn't given them to me, right? But I think the question is, how can my present be different? How can my present be different if I resist those things? And, I think really when we can get far enough away, we can start to say, hey, those things that were so awful, has there been anything good that's come out of them? And that's what redemption's about. Redemption means that something that was neutrally or ill-intended has produced gifts. And maybe those gifts are things like sensitivity or empathy or resilience or discipline. And being able to find those even in disasters is, according to that book we read this last year, is what the difference between people who survive and people who don't. People who can find awe and wonder in the middle of like hurricanes and being lost in the woods, those are the people who survive. And that's an interesting thing to think, that even in dark moments you can find awe and you can find wonder. It doesn't mean you have to. And I think that's a really important thing. There's opportunities. I don't know if that was helpful. And you asked the question, Ellen, so you get to decide when we're done with it.
I get to decide what?
When we're done with it.
Oh, I'm done. That was very helpful. It's a different way of thinking and looking at it. And I do think that sometimes I still struggle in that some of the effects are very subtle, but I find I'm realizing that I hold back a lot from deeper relationships just out of fear.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's,
and I think that's very reasonable, right? It's very reasonable that you've got a wounded part. And there's a thing that my one of my massage therapists told me, which is your body always keeps score. And so sometimes you might have like hurt yourself, and you may say like, I've done the rehab, I'm good. And your body actually remembers that and does something to your range of motion to protect itself from getting hurt again. And you can get really mad at your body, but it's really just trying to protect you. And it's a great reminder, right, that sometimes we have these ways, not just physically, but being with others and being with ourselves, that like we think are protecting us, and they're holding us back from the lives we'd like to live. So how we renegotiate that, I mean, really, we need to get our body's trust back. And we do that through things like rest and through stretching, right? We do that through not overloading it or jumping right back where we were. We do that through changing our form so that we don't, get out of whack like that. And those are the same opportunities I think we have to hold for ourselves psychologically and spiritually.
that's the hard part.
It is the hard part. And, I think there's days where it feels like, oh my God, I have to do so much work just to stay sane. And the good refrain is actually like the work is so that I can enjoy what I've got. And it can be daunting to think about the work, but the payoff, is the actual journey.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I'm right. I mean, I like you, am trying to, well, I'm not calling you out. I'm saying like anybody else, I've learned a lot of coping mechanisms that have served me well, but also hold me back. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I actually be grateful for myself? And I think like there are areas in which I feel very grateful for the gifts I have and the person that I am. And there are other parts that I felt like other people hated in me, and I continue to hate in myself. And like, that's part of being reconciled. And that's I think the gift of the sacrament is meant to help us open up. Yeah. The sacrament won't give you the gift. The sacrament helps you enjoy the gift you already have before you, or to see the gift that God has already, put in your lap, hopefully. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am about that.
Makes sense.
Well, let's come back to it if you want. But first, I want to tell you about a cockamamie theory called affect theory, because it'll get us, I think, into things like shame and guilt pretty well. So we're going to talk again about burdens. Sin is burden, and sin can be missing the mark too. But I got this in seminary. It was really great, and a lot of people have moved past affect theory. It's really become pretty hand in hand with something called Polyvagal Theory. Stephen Porges is the guy who did that. Sylvan Tompkins is the guy who did affect theory. And here's the basic premise of it. If you know anything about our brain development, your brain, if you put your thumbs in and put your hands together, that's about how big your brain is. I mean, really. And of course, there's two lobes, right? You've got your right and your left. And one of them is about creativity, one's about logic, sort of. I mean, just in general, but it doesn't work like that, because if you lose one lobe, this one will do all of that for you. But the way our brain's formed, right, is that we have this instinctual part that's sort of right here. This is the same kind of brain a reptile's born with, like fight, flight, fear. Some diagrams show it like this. So imagine that this is like your limbic system. This is where like your survival emotions come from. Some people say there's an even older part than that, and that's your limbic system. As mammals, our brain grows over that, right? And particularly, you get this as a man when you're about 26. When you're a woman, you get it much earlier, like when you're 22, right? And this part of our mammalian brain is able to suspend things like fight, flight, fear, freeze, and enter into things like compassion, right? Because mammals take care of their offspring and reptiles don't. And as you know, right, it takes at least 12 years to raise a mammal to be somewhat self-sufficient. Although I know plenty of 30-year-olds that aren't done with that. So you do too, right? This is part of the brain growing down. And what's really interesting, and you can see this in children, when they get hungry, when they get tired, when something intense happens, they can lose their mammalian brain just like this and do all their thinking with this instinctual part, right? So it's really helpful to think like, hey, you really do lose your mind sometimes. You lose your mind and you enter right into emotional or hardwired reactive instinctual thinking, the lizard brain. And there's been a lot of work on this, right, that says that our brains haven't quite figured out the difference between a physical threat and like a verbal threat. So when you see a lion, you're hardwired to go right to instinct. You're either going to run away, or you're going to figure out how do I fight it, or you're going to like play dead so it'll hurt less when it kills you. I mean, those are sort of what we're hardwired to do. But our brain actually hasn't figured out how a lion is different from somebody saying, I hate you. We have the same emotional response of losing our mind and going right to instinctual thinking when somebody criticizes us as we do when there's a real physical threat in front of us. I know that doesn't sound like it could possibly be true, but all of the research confirms it. So where does all of that come from? Well, that's what affect theory tries to say, right? So affects are these hardwired biological responses to stimuli. So that could be a threat, it could be a comfort, it could just be something that shows up, right? And this happens when we're infants. So sometimes we say, oh, look, the baby feels happy. And probably not. Probably the baby has an instinctual reaction to stimuli. As those things start to happen more and more, and as our brain really starts to develop, we can actually be aware of what we're doing to stimuli. And our awareness of what we're doing, Tompkins calls feeling. So we're aware of what we're doing, that's a feeling. Now, what Tompkins says, and this is really interesting, is that babies, right when they're born, they have hardwired instinctual responses to stimuli that show up in their faces. And I mean, you can verify this. When a baby doesn't want to have the food you're giving, they stick out their lip or they stick out their tongue, right? And what do you know? That's called disgust. That's the affect of disgust. It's related to food. It's not related to something that you've said or your politics. Although think through, as we grow up, right, we can have the same disgust reaction to something somebody says. So what's initially something environmental can turn into something that's psychosocial. Tompkins says there's 9 of these. Dis-smell, like when something smells bad, we can put our lip forward to kind of shield our nose. And you can bear that out, right? When there's a really bad odor, people will like scrunch up their face so they don't smell it as strongly. But you'll also see people do that, again, when somebody says something about politics that they don't agree with. They get the dis-smell face, which is like a shielding mechanism, like, oh, something's really bad, I don't want to fully interact with it. So there's dis-smell and there's disgust. There's things like surprise, like every baby, when you surprise them, goes like this. Adults do that too, right? And people can be surprised with something that you say or with an image that you show. Surprise is a neutral thing. Could be good or bad. It just wasn't what you were expecting. One of those affects is the affect of shame. And this is really interesting because the way the shame is supposed to work is it's a way of disconnecting you from a visual stimulus. And the way they normally talk about this, right, is that when infants make eye contact with mom, particularly, there's some identity fusion going on, like identifying with mom or identifying with dad. And then the shame affect disconnects them when they look down. It actually sends them into themselves. So this is like a normal way of developing your identity, is that you disconnect from somebody else so that you can form yourself. What's really interesting is that when shame turns into an emotion, you can see this. I don't know if you've met people that never make eye contact. Maybe they look at your forehead and you know that's what they're doing, or they look down. Shame starts to become an emotional response when you don't make an eye contact with somebody, and it usually has to do with felt unworthiness. I'm not worthy to make eye contact with somebody else. I'm not good enough, and eyes go down. All of these things start out very neutral, including things like anger and surprise and joy. Again, they're just ways that we respond to stimuli, and they're hardwired. But as we become aware of them, they start to become feelings. And when we have feelings and we've got memory, then we've got emotions. And out of these things, we come up with rules. These are called scripts. You know, they repeated themselves a number of times. And when we get enough scripts, we have our personality. This is kind of what affect theory says. And it's really interesting. There's these crime shows. There was a really popular one a couple of years back where the detective could tell if you were lying based on a couple of like facial movements when they asked you a question. All of that is embedded in polyvagal thinking and affect theory because there is a hardwired response from brain to face with all of these responses to stimuli. I don't know if this is interesting or not, but I want to tell you, like, to me, this is really interesting to think that shame is a tool that allows us to develop ourselves, right? But unfortunately, it can become a way of life that disconnects us from other people in a negative way. So usually when we talk about shame, we're not talking about how shame is just that fundamental disconnect so that we can explore ourselves. Shame has developed as a feeling and an emotion as a script of a way of saying, I'm not worth connecting to you. And the way Brene Brown defines it, which I think is helpful, shame is a feeling, the feeling is a feeling of failure in the self. And it goes like this: there's something wrong with me. So-and-so didn't show up to my birthday. It's because there's something wrong with me. So-and-so said, I'm not as attractive as I used to be, and they're right, I'm really ugly. That's different from guilt. Brene Brown does something with guilt. She says guilt is when I made a bad decision. Shame is when I am bad. Guilt actually, according to Brene Brown, presumes a platform of worthiness. Because look, if you made a bad decision, you chose that, you can choose differently. Like you have agency and ability to choose different next time. So it turns out that people who are shame prone, who feel like there's something deficient in their bodies and their thinking and their personality and their way of being, all of those kind of shame prone behaviors are really correlated with failure, drug use, addiction. Whereas guilt prone behaviors are actually really correlated with success, because you're very aware of the decisions you make and the consequences that they bring, and you feel like you've got enough worth where you can choose something different. That's Brene Brown's thinking. I don't know if it's helpful to hear that. All of these words get defined differently according to who you're reading, and there is a lot of other School of Psychology people who would say that the guilt actually is a fear of punishment. I feel guilty means, uh-oh, somebody is going to get even with me. Maybe it's helpful just to tease out. Embarrassment is related to shame, but embarrassment is temporary, and it's this understanding like, hey, this could be anybody. Think through how different embarrassment and shame could be. Like imagine you leave the restroom and there's toilet paper stuck in your sock. You could say like, oh man, that was embarrassing, and it could have happened to everybody else. Or you could say, I am so worthless. I didn't even notice that. Of course that happened to me. And that would be shame. And so I hope you can hear the difference. Embarrassment's not comfortable, but it's temporary. Humiliation is related to shame because humiliation is when you try to shame somebody. If you resist it, it's humiliation. If you accept it, it's shame. So if somebody says to me, well, I mean, sure, you're an okay writer for a man. I could say like, don't talk to me that way. I am not going to be humiliated that way. Or I could say, oh God, you're right. Men suck and I'm a man, so I suck. And that would push it into the shame category. I don't know if that makes sense. Sometimes we grew up hearing like, you need to have more shame because shame's an effective teaching tool, but it's not. Shame is never an effective teaching tool. It's degrading and it strips people of their fundamental humanity and dignity. A lot of my elders and parents and grandparents believe that there were things you just should be ashamed of, including like sexuality. I mean, that's the gift of 2 generations ago, and it's too bad because it wasn't helpful. And a lot of times there's this phrase, poop rolls downhill. Usually I don't use the word poop, but people who have deep shame tend to give that little gift to other people. And oftentimes things we're ashamed of, we don't realize our parents were also ashamed of as well, and they gave that to us. Probably not intentionally. That's just what they gave. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said to me something that very much embodied a lot of the parenting I got from my village, not just my own parents, but hey, I do this thing in order to be a good example for my kids. I want to be a good example. So I hate the way my body looks, but I don't want my kids to hate their body, so I'm going to act like I don't hate my body. But you realize, of course, that's not actually a very good example. Because, as the African proverb says, never take a shirt from a naked man. You can't give something you don't have. So if I really want my daughter to learn that her body is fine the way it is, if I want her to learn that from me, I have to really believe that about my own body. And I can't trick her by acting like I think that when I don't. And this is the really hardest thing I think about teaching and living out of shame, right? I have to really believe that I'm worthy of dignity and joy and happiness, not just her. Well, I want my kids to be happy, but I know I don't deserve that. What they will get from you is they don't deserve it either. And that's the catch-22. You only are a viable example when you believe that you deserve love and dignity and connection. And of course, the whole problem with shame is it's the belief that you don't deserve those things because there's something wrong with you. I'm actually really convinced that this is why evangelical Christianity is so successful, because the fundamental message is there is something wrong with you. You felt like there was something wrong, and you're right. God will fix it. But I have to tell you, having grown up evangelical and actually suffered from it, God never fixed that for me. No matter how many times I prayed the sinner's prayer, I still felt like there was something wrong with me. And I thought, actually, maybe if I do it more, or if I believe it more, then it'll work. If I believe even more there's something wrong with me, then I'll get the solution from God that there's not. And I think it works the other way around. Okay, let me pause there. I might have said something that was not interesting, or I might have said something you want to know more about, or maybe the connections don't make sense. I just want to pause.
Hi, Mike. Or hi, everybody. Well, this is I really enjoyed your showing of the facial expressions and helping that raise my awareness about that. And I'm getting ready to go on a walk, and I'm writing down different things I want to meditate on. And one of them is that letting go of shame. What a profound concept, because the way that you described it, I'm so grateful this is being recorded too, so I can listen to it again and maybe ask better questions next week. Is that I feel like, for so long I've been thinking that I have guilt and I don't know how to get rid of it, but what I really think I have is shame. Thank you for sharing some of that.
And that is really the gift you'll find in Brene Brown's work, is that the words actually really, really matter, how we use them. And that's how we started out, right? The way we use forgiveness is really, really important as a word, because it defines whether or not it's accessible or attainable or not. And I will tell you this, having been a shame-prone person, much more so formerly than I am now, I actually noticed when I took a particular class that did this affect theory, how uncomfortable I was making and holding eye contact with people. And here was a curious thing. When I made myself do it, when I made myself make eye contact and hold it, it actually helped me move out of shame a little bit. I didn't even have to believe I was worthy. I just had to lock eyes and hold it. Because, right,
Wow.
that's what happens in the limbic system. It is like subconscious. Holding on rewires some of your brain, and it rewires some of your feelings. Darlene, please.
That kind of throws me back to a comment that you made in I think the lesson today about, is it the 40-second rule? You have to do something or think something for 40 seconds before it makes, it gels. And this also connects with having to change how we think or how we behave in order to change the feeling. I can remember when my son Jamie was little, and he would throw these huge, horrendous fits that he was just so full of anger. And I would get frustrated, not knowing what to do to control, not being able to control that. And one of the things I learned to do was to just get down on his level, on my knees, and reach out for him. I did not feel love for him. I will be honest. I was angry too, but I made myself reach out and hold him, not in a hold, not a lockdown hold, but in a loving hold, holding him. And there was a certain amount of time, it was probably 40 seconds at least, that it took for him to relax and for me to relax. And the behavior of holding helped change the anger in him and me into an embrace of caring. I don't know if it was love yet, but there was a melting of that anger. So to me, that experience embodies the need to do something or say something different to change that emotion, to change the story of what's going on right there between two people.
Yeah, I think you've got it. And what's really interesting is to hear you don't actually have to be open to feeling it or not. There's a way you can position your body, like eye contact, that will actually transform how you're feeling anyway. And
Yes.
so, like a lot of people, I did this marriage therapy called Imago, and it talked about how long it takes for your brain to release the chemical oxytocin when you're hugging somebody. A lot of times you give your spouse a hug, you give your kid a hug, it's over in 2 or 3 seconds. It takes 40 seconds. So really what they try to say is aim for the 1 minute hug and go ahead and put a timer. It doesn't matter if you think that's too long or that's mechanical. If you hug somebody for 1 minute, your brain will certainly release oxytocin. Even if you tell it not to. That's the interesting thing. And there's this really interesting bit, right? Where if there's somebody you're naturally prejudiced towards, like you're homophobic or you're racist, if you hold their hand for 40 or more seconds, your brain will release oxytocin and it will help you overcome that prejudice that you have. And the more skin contact you get, the more skin on skin, the better. So if you really want to do it, you hold hands like that because you get more surface area contact. So really what would be great is to see Klans people hold hands with the Black Panthers like that for about a minute. And no matter what they want to have happen, naturally what will happen is their brain will release oxytocin and it will eventually help overcome some of those prejudicial feelings. I know that's crazy, but it's the case. And that's why, right, maybe you've heard of, there's a place in Colorado, I think it's called Greenwood, and they're real wacky. And they do these things, particularly with kids that are out of control, where parents actually do kind of hold them and hold them still. Mm-hmm. They're not putting them in a chokehold, but they're holding them and they're trying to like force eye contact, not in a dominant way, but in an open way. And even in that situation, oxytocin starts to be released for both people. Now, we all know there's a way you can hold somebody as a sign of dominance, and that's different. That won't release oxytocin. Like you can subdue somebody to dominate them, which is, by the way, like what rape is about and what sexuality looks like in the animal kingdom. It's a display of dominance. Or, right, there's a way of holding with some openness. And maybe it's not even like, hey, I want this to change. It's, I'm willing to be made willing. And then your brain will release these chemicals like serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine instead of adrenaline and cortisol. And what it takes, though, is people have to be willing to maintain that contact. This is where reconciliation is important. Both people have to be willing for the contact to be there, even if they're not sure about it. They have to be willing to make the contact. Otherwise, you could get oxytocin in one person and you could get adrenaline in the other. And that won't work for reconciliation. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying. So this becomes a really important thing when we talk about our prayer life, right, is that a lot of times we've adopted this middle-aged piety where we bow our heads because you're not supposed to look the monarch in the eye. And it becomes a really important exercise to think that God is desperately wanting you to make eye contact. That's why our Jewish brothers and sisters pray with their hands open and their heads aimed up at the sky. Now, look, I actually like to kneel when I pray, but in my mind's eye, it's really helpful to imagine God is courting your eye contact not shunning it. You may say, I don't feel worthy, and it's great to hear. It doesn't matter how you feel, God has made you worthy. I don't feel like I deserve it. Fine, maybe you don't, but God has made that decision, so you can choose to enjoy it or not, but God's already made that decision. What's interesting, right, is that shame and honor culture, and it still happens here, right, but it was very strong at the time of Jesus, and that's why we get this description in things like Hebrews where Jesus despised the shame of the cross. The whole idea that the cross is shameful, right, is the idea, and this is really interesting. We usually skip this part. I don't know if you've read this verse in Deuteronomy, cursed is anyone who is hanged upon a tree. We usually cut out the context. They're cursed if they stay there and don't get buried. Being hanged on a tree, I mean, you were executed. It's not shameful that you were executed. Well, it's shameful that someone did that to you. It doesn't mean there's something inherently wrong with you. The shame is when you deny somebody a burial, that's the shame. So sometimes we get this all wrong. And what's really interesting, right, is that reaching out to people who are in shame, I mean, like St. Francis kissing that leper was a way of Francis despising the cultural values of his day that said people deserved to be sick. And that's sort of like the message of the cross. So like, I think what we get to hear in Hebrews is you might very much be wrapped up in shame. And the message of the cross is Jesus despises that and would like to deliver you from it. Whether you have leprosy or you were abused as a child or etc. Despising shame is really about Jesus despising the idea that there is something inherently wrong with you. And it's a great reminder. We those of you who did the Enneagram, the very first lesson, the presenter said, hey, sin might just be a misconception of what life is meant to be. Or a sinner is someone who doesn't love themselves enough. And that's really interesting. And what I want to say is that visualization and imagining that you are worthy can be helpful, but sometimes it's just really hard to move out of a position of shame. And the reason it's so hard is that it's not just like an opinion. It comes all the way back to our hard wiring, and it's been repeated and repeated and repeated enough. And sometimes it takes a little bit more than just thinking like, oh, I don't have to be ashamed. The rite of reconciliation is designed to help us open up that gift, that not only is there nothing wrong with you, but that you are an expression of God's love for the universe. I don't know if that jump was too big, but the Catechism asks this question, what is grace? Grace is God's favor towards us, unearned and undeserved. And this is really important. Grace is not an investment, it's a gift. And God's gift is the forgiveness of our sins, whether those are moral transgressions or burdens that we carry, the enlightenment of our minds so that we can see ourselves as God sees us, the stirring of our hearts so we can have compassion for other people, and the strengthening of our wills. That's grace. So in some ways, I think it's really interesting to take that language.
Mike, can you repeat that? That is really profound.
I will repeat it. And I'll also, remember, I'm sending you the updated document each week. So after we get done today, I'm going to send you this document. I've updated some of the things from last week as well. If you know, like, and by the way, I might have it wrong. So it's a work in progress. But according to the prayer book, grace is God's favor towards us, unearned and undeserved. It's a gift. It's not an investment. God is not investing grace. God's just giving it away. By grace, God forgives our sins, both the wrong choices we've made and the burdens that we carry around that we didn't earn or deserve. God enlightens our minds. That means opens them up so that we can see ourselves like God already does. God stirs our hearts, the center of our emotions, so that we can have compassion for each other. And God strengthens our wills. And that's grace. As an evangelical, I learned that grace is an acronym, God's riches at Christ's expense. But I want to suggest to you that grace doesn't cost anybody anything. Grace is God's riches accessible in our minds through Christ's election. He chose to do that. So instead of thinking like it was a bill to be paid, it was a gift that God wanted and chooses to give us over and over and over again. And God, having given the gift, do whatever you want with it. But God hopes you'll enjoy it. So I think it becomes this really interesting thing. I'm going to talk about a couple of exercises really, really briefly. I didn't know if you've seen, and I've mentioned this before, so it's not new material, but I don't know if you've seen those ads for the organization called Smile Train. It shows usually about 9 children with cleft palates, and it's hoping that you will give them money so that you can give a really cheap surgery, actually, so that somebody can drink out of a cup. I mean, really, that's the deal. And there's a couple of ways I think you can choose to see those images. One way you can see them is, oh, that person's disfigured. I'll give money so I can make that go away. And I do think it's effective advertising for that way. I do. I think it's effective. But I think there's another option, which is you can look at that child that you don't know that's got something that you would be really afraid to have yourself. And you can stare at them until you see that God is fully present in that kid, no matter how they look. And boy, for $5, they could drink out of a cup. Why wouldn't you want to help them enjoy the life God's given them? And it's totally 2 different ways of interacting with the ad. And so there's this really great exercise where you go stand in front of a mirror and you make eye contact with yourself. And it probably won't happen the first time. But you look and you look and you look until you can see that God is fully present and delighted with the person in the mirror, with your skin and with your eyes and with your hair. And you stare that person down, not to dominate them, but to celebrate that God is there. You might start with the Smile Train ad before you look at yourself, because in general, it's easier when you've got shame to overcome it with other people. This is true. Easier to overcome it with other people. The opposite of shame is not flaunting. So if you've got body image, it's not like, hey, look, what I'm going to do is go around in like a Speedo and just show off my body. By the way, there's nothing wrong with people who choose to do that, but it's not like that's the next step in your journey. And it's not like that's the desirable end. We all have a different road that we get to walk, right? But the question is, can I be comfortable? Can I accept that God is embodied in me? God is embodied in my cellulite. That sounds crazy, but God is embodied in your cellulite. God is embodied in that skin tag I'm growing. Yes, God is. Yes. And if you choose to remove it, okay. But don't remove it because it'll make you better if you do. I don't know if that makes sense.
Hi, but I know we're going to end here real quickly. I wanted to just say thank you to my friend Rhonda who's joined us, and she's put her email up there.
Yep.
So
Rhonda Aquachin. Yep.
So welcome, Rhonda.
Yeah, and I'll encourage you in the document that I send out in just a few moments. That might have been more than enough for today, but let me pause and see. Is there a place you're hoping we go next? Is there a question about something that, showed up in the document? Is all of this just not working for you?
Hi, I'm Rhonda. I just want to say I'm really enjoying what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense, and I'm really got more out of this one discussion or listening than I've gotten out of a lot of things in my life, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Well, one thing can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, one thing and I don't mean to negate everything you just said, but one thing that's influenced me a lot in my life is the Lord's Prayer that, forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. And it's like, that influenced me a lot on, working towards, I'm not forgiven unless I forgive others, or.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Sally. I actually, I don't want to disagree with you, but I want to caution us. There's a way you can hear this story. Do you know this story in the Bible where there's a guy who owes a king $1 bajillion, and the king forgives that debt? Having been forgiven, the servant goes and demands $20 from his friend. His friend says, forgive me, or even I'll pay you back. And he could, and he won't forgive him. And the king hears about it, right? And the king tortures the original servant. And I'll just speak for myself, but I hear it, I'm like, yes, you're getting what you deserve. But you know what that means is the king didn't actually forgive that person. Because once you cancel a debt, it's gone. And I don't know that story is telling us how God is. I'm afraid that story is warning us about how we are. There's this terrible phrase I learned as a kid called Indian giver. It's terrible. I've actually done a lot of work culturally to hear how that worked. In the Native American culture, a gift was meant to be shared. And there were gifts given to European settlers and they didn't share. And so the Native Americans, they didn't take them back. They just shared them to other people. So there wasn't an understanding of personal property. There was understanding of corporate responsibility, right? I think the story actually warns us I know it's a terrible phrase, we're Indian forgivers. We don't actually forgive people as a gift. We forgive them as an investment. And if they do the wrong thing with our forgiveness, we hold it against them. And really what that means is we didn't forgive them. Beyond that, I don't think that's who God is. I think that's who we are. Because the whole belief is that grace is God's gift. Once you give a gift, it's not yours anymore. You gave it away, it's not yours. Darlene, please.
The way I interpret from my own thinking and prayer, that phrase in the Lord's Prayer is not, from my thinking, it's not a commandment, it's an encouragement. It's a reminder to me, it's an encouragement to me to work on forgiving others and to use God's example of forgiving me as how it's an aspiration for me to work on forgiving others because it's best for me. So I think of it as an encouragement, just like other verses that say, do not be afraid. It's not a commandment. I was taught that it was a commandment. Your faith is not good enough if you're afraid. For me, it's an encouragement. It's what we would say to a child. it's okay. You're going to be okay. You don't have to be afraid.
Yeah.
It's just another way of looking at that scripture.
Yeah, and I do think there's a way you can hear it as, hey, I mean, it's a little scary. You could say, God, I want you to judge me like I judge everybody else. You could hear it that way. I don't actually want God to do that. I want God to judge me much more generously than I judge other people, right? That's what I want. But I do think actually there's you can hear the prayer also as an intention. God, I really do want your forgiveness as I'm on my way to trying to forgive others. And it's an intention that I am going to go on my way and try. So instead of hearing it as, do unto me as I do unto others, you can say, I want this forgiveness, and I'm saying now before you, I want to be able to do that to other people. I'm on my way. Even if I barely left the starting point, I want to be on my way. Intention setting instead of judging ourselves. There's a whole lot of options. And I think, Sally, how do we know which one's right? It's the one that gives us life without costing somebody else.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just think God has to be so different from us in all of the best ways. In that story about God not forgiving us unless we forgive other people, well, hell, I'm better than that. I know to treat my kids better than that. So surely God's better than me at that. And the great news is, right, I'm encouraged to grow with God. You know, I mean, really, if God is just more vindictive than I am with more power, well, there's nothing better about that. The better is God is not vindictive like I am, which means I don't have to be. Well, I think. And this is where you start to realize, I think, in things like reconciliation, how different revenge is from rehabilitation, right? And a lot of times we say, well, you know, look, if you hurt somebody, you can never really replace it. So you should just go to prison and suffer. But nobody gets more life out of that formula. And this is where our justice system is really flawed. We settle for punishment and revenge because they're the easy things to calculate and figure out. But nobody gets more life out of that. And even if we don't do it to convicts, we do it to ourselves. Oh, I should be miserable to make up for something that I did. How does that make up for something that you did? You just lose more life. The question is, how are you going to go forward? God does not want to punish you. God wants to restore you. Reconciliation is not about getting even, it's about going forward. Remember, I didn't think that God needs you to confess things. I just think we need to do that. And God will work with us. Okay, I'm going to send out my little white paper to you. And you don't have to read it. It's just there. And I'm going to continue to update it as I have time or as I see fit. And I would be grateful for your help in updating it. And again, thank you, Ellen, for starting us out with a really, really great question. And if you continue to have questions, whether it's Ellen or somebody listening after we're done on YouTube, please send them to me because I want this to be valuable. And I have to be honest, I didn't grow up in a church where we talked about sin and forgiveness like this. I didn't. And I want to be a church that does that because I sense there's an opportunity for my life and for yours here. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next week, or I'll hear from you when I do, and I'm grateful you chose to join us today.
Thanks.